given the challenging economic situation, the drop in consumer confidence, the high youth unemployment, I sort of thought that maybe this would be a moment for populism where we might see that the premier said, basically, I feel your pain. We see that people are struggling, and we're going to make sure that, the country's going in the right direction. And there really wasn't that kind of moment there.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this discussion on the Chinese National People's Congress meeting. My name is Mary Gallagher. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm here on behalf of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations to offer this really interesting discussion on the two meetings that just occurred. I'm pleased today to talk with Jessica Teets, the professor of political science at Middlebury College, and Jack Zhang, assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas, about the annual two sessions meeting that just concluded in Beijing. I'm going to proceed through a number of questions, and feel free, Jessica or Jack, to interrupt me or ask your own questions to each other. So for Jessica, I'm going to start off with you. For a bit of background, could you explain the significance of the two sessions in China's domestic and foreign policy realms, and as well as how this fits into China's broader political system? Very, very, easy, simple questions to answer.
Exactly. Well, I think the short answer is that we've seen that the National People's Congress is held in conjunction with the Consultative Congress, which is why we call it the two meetings, and that usually this is a focus on policy making. So the policy initiatives that the party has been discussing previously, these are usually voted on at this time period. So this usually is a signal of new policy directions. It's not usually, though, a setting for policy discussion as much as it is for sending a signal about a new policy direction. So it's a little bit more of a rubber stamp than, sort of a true parliament where there's going to be debate and discussion. So that's usually the way that I think about it, is that we're going to get signals about new directions for policymaking. It's also a ritual of legitimacy. So that's usually the way I think about it.
Great, thank you. That's great. That's a great summary. So Jack, could you talk a little bit about the economic goals and policies that were outlined in this year's two sessions, particularly around China's attempt to restart the economy after COVID, attract more foreign investment, and signaling to the private sector maybe some changes in policies?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and honored to share the virtual stage with two luminaries of the field. The headline news, of course, is that the GDP target for growth is set at around 5%, right? Which I think a lot of commentators have been saying is pretty ambitious, given the higher baseline of where we're at with where the economy is at, both in terms of headwinds and in terms of ending the zero COVID policy last year. The other thing that's worth highlighting is that the stimulus, I think everyone was looking to see sort of what kind of stimulus policies will be put into place. And I think, again, the consensus there is that it's relatively modest, right? So measures to boost the economy includes a $1 trillion yuan national bond issue, which, the central government will be taking over some of the local government debt issues there, but the overall deficit rate is holding steady at about 3%. So it's not, there's not a bazooka style, right, stimulus that folks were looking out for. And then I think another dimension that is worth highlighting here is just the continuity in terms of the focus, right, on production, on increasing sort of productivity and high technology, the so-called new productive forces, which really focus on development, like domestic development of these advanced manufacturing and high-tech sectors, rather than consumption, or at least sort of across the balance of the two, right, weighs more heavily with an emphasis, I think, on production. On the consumer side, I think there are again, modest measures like EV tax credits and support for the tourism industry. There's modest increases in social welfare spending. My favorite of which I think that they highlighted is that they're going to raise pensions by 20 RMB a month, which is like $3. Right. So $3 a month, it helps, but it's not going to be, I think, life-changing or sort of economy changing. They're also going to subsidize student loans for college students as well. But you don't see the kinds of ambitious reforms that have been put off for a long time that a lot of folks are looking out for in the third plenum, like hukou reform or pension reforms, being rolled out here to support the economy from a consumption perspective. So what does all of that, I think, together mean? I think, to me at least, it signals that there's not a willingness to do a full court press on growth, but rather, that there's confidence, I guess, in Beijing that what they're doing is working, right? And I think that doesn't jive quite so well with where we are in terms of business sentiment, or especially foreign investor sentiment. And there seems to be a lack of awareness or indifference to that is highlighted by the fact that, right, they canceled the traditional prime minister press conference, which is one of these few opportunities a year where the top leadership gets to communicate directly, right, with domestic and sort of foreign press on these national policy issues. And this is surprising because Prime Minister Li Qiang has, in his tenure in Shanghai, a pretty good reputation for working with foreign business. At least that's what folks say, right? And it doesn't seem to be, right. No one knows what the background for this is, but it's not a very costly thing to have a press conference, right? And it would signal continuity at a time when business sentiment is already wavering, and so it's a strange choice to decide that, and so to me that signals either a lack of awareness or indifference to business sentiment and consumer sentiment.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about the lack of stimulus, or the fact that it's such a minor part of the policy. Do you think that that's because Xi Jinping thinks that the stimulus won't work, that he doesn't find them effective? Or do you think that he's worried about giving away that sort of fiscal lever to local governments and that they might waste it or engage in corruption? What do you think is behind that decision?
I mean, I can speculate, but it probably seems like more of the latter, right? That a lot of the lessons learned from the stimulus of the post-global financial crisis, right, was this idea that local government debt ballooned because they, opened up the fiscal levers too much, and there was a lot of wasteful spending, and some of the problems that we're at now, right, with local government debt, truthfully can be traced to that. And so I think there's an unwillingness to sort of repeat that. But I think it also comes from just, the statist kind of instincts, right, that we can control, factors of production, and that's going to be where we're going to generate sort of the difference. And we don't necessarily need or maybe trust, right, so handing out. I mean, China didn't get, right, the kinds of checks, right? The consumers didn't get sort of a stimulus sort of check that, again, helped, I think, with a lot of households during the pandemic, but, ultimately also did contribute somewhat to inflation as well. So that's a delicate balance. But I think the comfort level and also the lessons of the past are that we would rather do these things where the central government can control and channel, rather than just let a bunch of money go towards, a bottom-up type of, way of generating growth.
Right.
I have just one.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Mary.
I just have one follow-up to Jack's comments, and then I have some more political questions for Jessica. But Jack, you mentioned new productive forces and the lack of emphasis on consumption, no real big stimulus. But at the same time, I do feel like this emphasis on high quality growth or high quality development, new productive forces, and we can see in the data, a big increase in government investment into manufacturing. So I guess there's two questions. One is, isn't that also potential for wasteful investment, sort of feeding excess capacity or corruption for that matter, or just wasting the money? And then second, do you see, in terms of the policy details about how this focus on high quality development is going to be implemented, do you see this as a feasible goal for the party?
Yeah, I think those are really excellent questions. And especially on your first point, I do worry that this doubling down of industrial policy in China, right, and then the Western reactions that will engender will contribute to something like an economic security dilemma happening, right? Where what you're trying to do is, defensive or domestic sort of oriented and trying to get growth that way. But it's going to be interpreted as, mercantilistic and merit sort of an equal proportionate industrial policy response on the part of foreign governments. And so, yeah, so that could end up in this destabilizing sort of spiral where economic policies to try to revitalize one's own manufacturing sector, right, engenders sort of worry in other governments to do the same thing. And at the very least, that will lead to a fraying of the rule-based, system for international commerce that undergirds globalization, right? I think it is worth highlighting that this, the work report this year, stands in sharp contrast with, I look back and read the one from 2021, and I was, in the beginning, right, pre sort of Biden administration, and there was mentions of a Korea-Japan FTA, a European investment sort of treaty that they want to negotiate, and specifically better relations with U.S. China business. And there's none of that in this current document. And where they mention sort of foreign trade at all, it's strengthening sort of China-ASEAN trade. So I think that signals that 3 years of the Biden policy of de-risking, right, is in some ways working, and that China, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this package of policies being emphasized is that leaders in Beijing do feel like technological self-reliance is necessary, not only for economic reasons, but also for security reasons, and it's more urgent than ever, given these technological containment efforts. I mean, the Biden administration doesn't like to call it that, right? But that's very much how they are perceived in China, and in reality, sort of what the impact looks like. And so I think there's a feeling that the old system, right? You can call it supply chain resilience, right? This kinds of concern is mirrored on the Chinese side as well, that they think that they're overly reliant on Western technology. And so, one thing that we see this year is that the science and technology budget is being boosted 10%, right? They see very much that is an area in which it is worth, spending over, right? So that's double the expected GDP growth target, right? So it's at least twice as important as everything else, right, to spend money on. I can see where that comes from, but I think given the international context, right, I worry that we're already seeing these kinds of responses from here in the United States and in Europe, right, about this flood of Chinese EVs, right, coming for automakers in Michigan, right, where you're currently at, Mary, and there's a lot of worry about that, and there might be market restrictions put into place to do that, and that will further strengthen sort of those in China who believe that you need to do self-reliance because foreign suppliers are untrustworthy and these markets are going to be closed. And so that's really worrying that the spiral might continue.
Great. Okay, I'm going to switch areas of emphasis a bit for some questions for Jessica around what's going on in the leadership with really what we see right now is that the premier's role has been downgraded. He's no longer giving the press conference. It's unlikely that we have any sense of a succession plan anytime soon. So within Xi's own loyal support system, there are two potential rival networks, the Fujian faction, which includes Xi's chief of staff, Cai Qi, and the Zhejiang faction headed by Li Qiang, the premier. There are no party elders with any sway to speak of at this point. So what are some things to look out for within Xi's inner circle for any indication of power jostling? Do we see new factions forming because, he's in his third term? it becomes more and more uncertain as he proceeds and ages, whether he'll, continue into a fourth, and certainly what would happen as into even a fifth term. What is your sense in terms of these power struggles at the top, if there are power struggles?
Right. I like how you save the easy questions for me. I mean, I think that no one really knows the answer to who is going to be the successor. I've been reading a lot of people like Neil Thomas at Asia Society Policy Institute, Jude Blanchett at CSIS. Lots of people have been speculating about this, looking for sort of clues in, where people are standing or what sort of policy responsibility they're getting. And I just think the answer is really that we just don't know. And I think that this is purposeful. It's not that we're bad at our jobs. It's simply that for Xi Jinping at this point, he feels like he's getting better work and more loyalty out of people by not being clear about who a potential successor might be. I think that it's pretty clear that he values loyalty, which is why we see, Fujian, Zhejiang, places where he's worked and he's known people. The fact that he values this loyalty probably means that he's leaning on these people a lot more. But I don't know if that really tells us anything about who he might pick as a successor. We also see that there's increasing emphasis on certain parts of the economy, and that he's really looking for these people to deliver, such as, aerospace and these sorts of sectors. So does that reliance over time, is he going to give back to them in the form of political loyalty and, elevate somebody in that aerospace faction to be a successor? I think it's really unclear. And, at this point, I think his interests are best served by keeping that ambiguous and making sure that all these people are working as hard as they can to impress him. So I'm not going to answer the question in that, I don't think that we really do have an answer. And I think we should expect this ambiguity and this sort of internal factional competition to continue.
Jack, you mentioned the cancellation of the premier's press conference. Jessica, do you have any sense of why that might have happened? I totally get your point that this is something that we really can't know for sure. This is the most black box part of Chinese politics. But I noticed in teaching that this is something that my Chinese students in particular were really shocked by. So do you have what's your interpretation of the decision?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this when it happened. Is there some bigger message that's being communicated to us? And I guess that there could be a bigger message, but it might just be more of a functional decision in that with this political centralization that we've seen, we don't really have, a more independent press corps that's asking tough questions. So a lot of the situations that we've seen in these meetings in the past where, the premier will go a little bit off script and really share what he thinks about like poverty alleviation or, other sorts of things in the economy, that's not really going to happen anyway. And so it could be that the party has basically decided, we're the best ones to transmit our own message. We don't want to dilute it by passing it through the press or allowing our message to be changed in any way. So let's just go ahead and cancel this. So it could simply just be a functional decision like that. But I think that other people have said that this could also maybe be a signal about economic concerns and that they don't want to create the potential that awkward questions might get asked about economic growth or youth unemployment. I don't know how likely that is, given that these events were already pretty tightly scripted anyway. But, at the end of the day, I think that the really difficult thing is that this does decrease information transparency. It was a very small mechanism anyway, but it's just yet another thing that's being removed so that it really is like black box politics, right? We all have to read the tea leaves to try to figure out what's happening, and we don't have a lot of sources of good information.
Jack, how about you? Do you have any other interpretation of the cancellation of the press conference?
Yeah, same reading the tea leaves, just that, well, it would be funny if the concern was, wow, we might get some tough questions, so it would be embarrassing not to have that. It's just like, it doesn't make the questions go away if you don't have them be asked on the record, so it's a little bit of a, yeah, if that's the case, that's a very emperor's has no clothes kind of story of like, if they don't ask it, that means these questions don't exist or
Right,
something. Yeah.
right. Well, since this is a National Committee on U.S. China Relations interview, I wanted to turn to first Jessica and then Jack, how you interpret the two meetings and foreign policy changes. Do you see anything? I mean, Jack, you mentioned already that the U.S. and hopes for sort of better relations or hopes for free trade agreements with some of the United States allies. All of that has sort of gone out the window. What do you see for foreign policy in the year ahead?
Yeah, I really think that we're seeing a lot more continuity than change. I didn't see anything that, was really particularly shocking or made me reassess what I was thinking about for foreign policy. Especially the language around Taiwan seemed pretty standard. I didn't see anything too surprising there. Um, I guess one thing that I saw that seems to be a clear signal was in the Premier's work report talking about sort of delinking the Chinese economy from the U.S. one. I'm not trying to steal Jack's thunder here, as I'm sure he'll want to talk about that. But it seems like this focus on quality growth, focusing on high technology sectors, the green economy, like electric vehicles, that there were pretty heavy signals that this is going to be a continued area of focus. So it seems like we're seeing more of those efforts to de-link these two ecosystems. That there's going to be the U.S. one, there's going to be the Chinese one. In a really positive note, I mean, something that I really took heart from in these meetings was this continued discussion about greening BRI projects. I think this is a really good sign for just the environment overall, but also there were a lot of countries that have refused to engage in these BRI projects. Like I was just in Vietnam and Thailand, and they've been really resistant to these projects because they don't like the China model of development. And policymakers there are talking about greening the BRI and making it much more attractive to their countries. So I thought that was a really positive note.
Great. How about you, Jack? What are you thinking for foreign policy?
Yeah, I think Jessica hit a lot of the highlights. I would, underscore all of them and add one thing that I did find to be new though in this year. So, in the past couple of work reports, they've rolled out what you can call like the trilogy or the Xi Jinping ideological cinematic universe, right? Of the Global Development Initiative, right, in 2021, the Global Security Initiative in 2022, and this year we saw included in the work report, I think for the first time, the Global Civilization Initiative, right? And so these are getting like vaguer and vaguer, but more and more ambitious, right? In terms of what they're to do. And I think a lot of the commentary about this, right, is talking about this as China's sort of answer to the Western sort of claim on universal values. And, the answer now is China's not, it's not that China's different because it's an autocracy. It's not different because it's a communist state, right? But it's an ancient civilization that is on par with other ancient civilizations. And so I can see where that comes from. But I think it's worth, noting that that's a deeply conservative message, right? An idea in some ways, and like a stark departure from where, or at least the ideological basis of Chinese foreign policy in the past, going back to Mao. So it'd be interesting to see what Mao would think about this new global civilization initiative and Chinese civilizational, exceptionalism in some ways. And I think, I worry about the echoes of like Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations that have been kind of discredited, at least somewhat in the West and among scholars. That goes without saying with this group, right? But modern polities don't neatly map onto these ancient civilizational boundaries, right? And it sounds a lot like spheres of influence for great powers, right? And then I think, my wife is Korean, and so, the Korean sort of view on this would be like the irredentism for Chinese neighbors, right? So civilizations had these vaguely defined historical boundaries, and there's all these sort of ties, right? But what is the, yeah, so sphere of influence for great powers, and then like what does that mean in terms of territorial sort of control for these areas? Like, what is the geographic boundary of Chinese civilization, right? These are worrying, I think, problems that probably would be criticized as historical nihilism in today's Beijing, but I think they're real and valid. And as we see, I mean, it's in the work report, so there's going to be a lot more follow-up, right, on a policy front to sort of implement this. And if this just means that it's going to be cultural exchanges and things like that, that's fine, right? And saying mutual respect for civilizations, if you define civilizations in a granular way, and every modern state that is sovereign has its own right to civilization, maybe that's fine, right? But I'd really keep an eye out on sort of how this thing is going to be implemented, right? And the potential pitfalls that there might be.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think it also reflects, perhaps, also a very worrying way on China's, particularly Xi Jinping's relationship with Vladimir Putin, and Putin's own interpretation of, Russia's historical civilization and its claims to territory that it deems to be within that civilization, obviously, including Ukraine. That could potentially then change China's stance on Ukraine. Up to now, it has, I think, emphasized or hasn't actually called into question sovereignty, but I could see that being a really important shift. I think we are almost out of time, and I believe I was asked to do a lightning round of what most surprised you, but I think both of you have said that you weren't particularly surprised. So why don't we just go to each of you? I'll start with Jessica first, to maybe, instead of talking about being surprised or not surprised, talking about what are your expectations for this year, given the outcomes of the Congress.
I think I can put those two together in that one thing that I found that was surprising that I think is going to influence policy a lot in the upcoming year is that they did set a fairly ambitious growth target, but didn't really outline much of a stimulus. So I had thought that they maybe wouldn't set an ambitious growth target, or if they set one, that they would have a more ambitious stimulus package. And instead, they set an ambitious growth target without an ambitious stimulus package. And it's really unclear what's going to happen, because I think that most of us would expect then that they're not going to be able to hit that growth target. But we also know the political pressure that's going to be involved, for people to try to make it. And so will we see some sort of rush, closer to the end of the year where there is a bigger stimulus package, or will we see maybe other fiscal levers being pulled at the local level in order to increase growth? So that was something that I found surprising, was sort of the way that they put that policy package together. And I think it's going to mean that we really need to look at the local stimulus that we might see over the next year. Jack, I hope that wasn't what you were going to say too. And okay, good.
No,
stay in your lane.
I jumped my notes. I was going to talk about the Global Civilization Initiative as something that was surprising, but I think, my concluding thoughts are, I think the reassurance in this is that there's a whole lot of continuity. And I think Jessica Weiss said this in an interview about this, right? Like that, China, when faced with these domestic kind of challenges, will probably be battening down the hatches and not trying to be assertive sort of on on foreign policy issues without being provoked, right? And so that might be a good thing. On the other hand, going back to something that I said earlier, in terms of how they're going to get out of this sort of economic challenging economic times, is that I was very disappointed that there was not more of a message of reassurance to the private sector and to foreign investors, which we know, right, have been engines of, key engines of Chinese economic growth since opening and reform, right? And so there, I understand that the need to move policy sort of in a new direction and getting past that, but I think, I don't see a bridge to sort of get there, and then that a lot of these policies that are put into place, as I alluded to earlier, might actually undermine and make lives much more difficult for certainly foreign investors in China trying to do business with China, and potentially also the private sector that does not is not aligned in one of these areas of new, technological sort of growth and whatnot, right? I mean, the majority of the private sector is not engaged in producing advanced, import substitution American technology, right? And so what happens to sort of the modal sort of firm there?
And if I could add to that, I was actually a little bit surprised too that I thought that given the challenging economic situation, the drop in consumer confidence, the high youth unemployment, I sort of thought that maybe this would be a moment for populism where we might see that the premier said, basically, I feel your pain. We see that people are struggling, and we're going to make sure that, the country's going in the right direction. And there really wasn't that kind of moment there. And so I found that to be a little bit surprising because given all these indicators and the way that people are talking, about youth unemployment and the direction of the country, it would seem like that would have been a good moment. And we didn't really get a sense of that kind of reassurance.
Yeah, you would actually have to acknowledge that things are going in the wrong direction to say that now it's going in the right direction. So
Good point.
A challenging find.
Yeah, I think those are really super interesting and important points because, as you noted at the beginning, it's potentially a sign of indifference, that they're not making these signals. And it doesn't surprise me that they're being indifferent to foreign investors because I feel like this has become a much more an administration that's really interested in self-reliance and autarky. But to also be indifferent to people within China, I think that's the really that's the more surprising aspect of it. But like you said, Jack, showing concern or doing some sort of policy calibration to improve confidence, I guess, would then demonstrate that people are in fact not confident and not as positive as Xi Jinping wants people to be. So any last thoughts about the National People's Congress, the Consultative Conference, or the future of Chinese politics?
Thank you, Mary.
I don't think I could do a good job in a minute for the future of Chinese politics, but I did want to thank both of you and say that, I learned a lot from your analysis.
Yeah, thanks you. So I learned a lot from this conversation. So I'm smarter than I was 30 minutes ago. So thank you both for that.